I was 43 and had been dating Charlie, 42, for 3 years. I thought our relationship was solid. I never expected anything like what eventually happened. Charlie had a daughter, Sarah, who was 17, and while I never tried to be her mom, we'd built a bond over time. She came to me with problems, especially since her relationship with her actual mom wasn't the best. I did my best to be supportive, and I thought we were in a good place as far as step relationships go. But now I see just how wrong I was about all of it. About a year ago, I started working on this big project that meant everything to me. It took months of late nights, loads of stress, and more energy than I thought I had. But finally, the hard work paid off. I started seeing bonuses and knew I was heading toward a place of financial security I'd been working for. I felt on top of the world. I wanted to do something special for Sarah. She had mentioned wanting a big party for her 18th birthday, a huge pajama-themed bash with a DJ, fancy cake, and even a night at a hotel with her friends. It was over the top, but I figured, why not? I set up a separate savings account, put money aside, and had nearly everything ready for it. Around that time, though, Charlie came to me with some business idea he'd been toying with. He wanted to start a company, but his idea, to be blunt, was not good. It didn't seem like it was going to work out, and it felt like a complete reinvention of something that already existed, and better than he could manage. Now, I wasn't against helping him with some funds if I believed in the project. But I didn't, and I told him as much. We weren't married after all, and I didn't want to risk my hard-earned money. Plus, I'd already set aside funds for Sarah's birthday. I wasn't about to drain her special day's savings for something I didn't believe in. Charlie didn't take it well. He tried to make me feel guilty, saying a supportive partner would help, and I felt bad for disappointing him. But deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong to say no. We argued, and he turned defensive, making me feel like I was the problem for not wanting to help. I apologized for the harsh delivery of my decision, but I stood my ground. I wasn't about to give in. After that, something in him changed. He became distant and critical, especially of my appearance. He started nitpicking, saying I should do more with my hair, comparing me to other women. He'd mention how another woman looked put together or suggest I try a certain style. I'd never felt insecure before, but his comments started wearing me down. And then there was his ex, Sandy. From the beginning, I hadn't had issues with her being in the picture, but she was always a bit of a sore spot. Charlie had assured me that their history was long over, promising they weren't in touch. So I let it go. But then I noticed Sarah getting cozy on social media with posts involving Sandy. They'd comment and like each other's updates, and it made me wonder if they still talked. When I'd bring it up to Charlie, he'd insist they weren't in contact. I wanted to believe him, but that feeling, that gut instinct that something was off, never fully went away. I brushed off my worries, pushing forward with Sarah's party plans and trying not to let his shady behavior get in my head. But things only went downhill from there. The tension between us was palpable. He would still toss little comments at me about his business or my lack of support, and he acted colder every day. Then came the business trip I had to take. It was only 10 days, but as soon as I left, his behavior turned even weirder. He barely called or texted, and when he did, it was brief and disinterested, like he was doing it out of obligation. He'd say he was busy or tired, but something about it felt like an excuse. One night, I couldn't reach him at all. I tried calling repeatedly and he didn't answer. When he finally replied hours later, he said he'd fallen asleep early. It didn't sit right with me, but what could I do from hundreds of miles away? Each time I brought up how he was acting, he brushed me off, saying I was overthinking things or being paranoid, but I wasn't. I knew in my gut something was off. So I decided to test him. I told him my trip was getting extended a couple of days, just to see if he'd do anything behind my back. In reality, I planned to come home early. When I arrived, the house seemed quiet and nothing felt out of place until I checked the trash. Right there, staring back at me, was a used condom wrapper. I didn't need to ask questions. The answer was obvious. My heart dropped. I was furious and hurt, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him right away. I wanted to know the whole truth. That night, I waited until he was asleep, and yes, I went through his phone. I needed answers, and what I found was worse than I could have imagined. Hundreds of messages with Sandy, conversations, voice notes, pictures. They'd been in contact the whole time, talking about everything like they were still together. The photos were the worst part, recent ones of them looking happy and cozy. And then I found photos of Sarah. She was with them, smiling, like they were all some big, happy family. I couldn't believe it. She knew about the affair the whole time, and not only did she keep it from me, but she actively participated, going on trips with them, making me out to be the fool. I felt utterly betrayed. After all I'd done for her, she had kept her dad's secret, probably thinking it was for the best. But there was no excuse for her silence. She had watched me plan her party, watched me work and save, all while knowing about the lie her dad was living. Charlie returned home the next day acting like everything was fine. I couldn't hold back anymore. I sat him down and confronted him, and when he tried to lie, I showed him the photos. He panicked, but he didn't have any real explanation. And that was it. I was done. I packed my things and left that night. But before I did, I went to the bank and closed the account I'd set up for Sarah's party. She didn't deserve a party funded by someone she'd betrayed. If she wanted a celebration, she could ask her dad and Sandy to pay for it. As for me, I was done being taken for a fool. After I left, I felt numb. It was like I'd been holding my breath for years, and now I could finally exhale. But it was hollow, empty. I'd walked away from 3 years of my life, not just from Charlie, but from Sarah too. It was the two of them keeping this secret that hurt the most. I didn't know if I was grieving a relationship or just trying to make sense of the lies that unraveled everything I thought we had. But no matter how I felt, I knew one thing for sure. I'd made the right choice. In the days that followed, I kept busy. I stayed at my friend Rachel's place, who, true to form, was an unfiltered voice of support. She reminded me that it was better to be alone than to be with people who had no respect for me. She didn't need to convince me. I was already starting to feel that too. But there was a part of me that couldn't just let go of the anger. The betrayal from Sarah stung in ways I hadn't anticipated. After all I'd done, she'd been in on it, playing along with her dad and Sandy, going on little family trips, and leaving me out in the cold. Charlie tried reaching out within days of me leaving. The texts started casually, asking how I was, trying to act like we were on speaking terms. I ignored him, hoping he'd take the hint, but a few days later he sent a message that caught me off guard. "Sarah's really looking forward to her birthday party. Please don't let what happened affect her." I almost laughed at the audacity. After everything, he was asking me not to cancel the party I'd been paying for. He really thought I'd just carry on as if nothing happened. I didn't respond. I'd already canceled everything the day I left. That party was long gone, just like any sense of responsibility I'd once felt to keep Sarah happy. She'd made her choices just like her father. Not long after, I got a message from Charlie's sister. Apparently, Charlie had gone to her playing the concerned father. She begged me to reconsider canceling Sarah's party, saying how disappointed she'd be and how she's just a kid. She didn't know any better. That message left me cold. Sarah wasn't some little kid who didn't understand right from wrong. She was 17, old enough to know that hiding an affair and lying to someone was wrong. She had gone on those trips, smiled for photos with her dad and Sandy, all while knowing I was at home planning and saving for her birthday. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. Rachel, of course, didn't mince words when I told her. "You don't owe them a damn thing," she said. "Sarah might be young, but she's not blind. She knew what she was doing." I knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. I'd put so much energy into trying to build a relationship with Sarah, and now it was all for nothing. Over the next few weeks, I worked to move forward. I ignored Charlie's texts, blocked his number, and started clearing out any reminders of our life together. I'd lost enough time to him and his drama. I wasn't about to waste any more. But then, just when I thought I was done hearing from them, I got a call from an unknown number. I picked up, and it was Charlie's sister again, practically begging me this time. She said Sarah was heartbroken and that it would really mean the world to her if you could reconsider the party. I cut her off. She didn't think about me when she lied, went on trips with them, or hid things from me. I'm done. I ended the call and blocked her too. I was exhausted from their attempts to manipulate me. They could throw Sarah a party themselves if it meant that much to them. But deep down, I couldn't shake this sense of guilt. I kept going over it in my head, wondering if I'd been too harsh, wondering if I should have done something differently. Maybe Sarah was just trying to keep the peace. Maybe she didn't fully understand the impact of what she'd done. But every time I thought about reaching out, I'd see those photos of her with them. She hadn't looked uncomfortable or conflicted. She'd looked happy, at ease with the lie, perfectly okay with keeping me in the dark. Rachel, being her direct self, wasn't having any of it. "You're putting yourself through this for nothing," she said. "Sarah knew what she was doing, and you don't need to fix their mistakes. If they want to blame someone, they can blame Charlie Dot." She was right. I had spent years trying to hold everything together, bending over backward to make them happy. Where had it gotten me? Betrayed and cast aside, as if I'd meant nothing. I wasn't about to let them keep pulling me back into their mess. I decided right then that I was done feeling guilty. I didn't reach out to Sarah, didn't send any birthday gifts, and didn't even think about throwing her that party. If she wanted a celebration, she could go to her dad or Sandy. They'd made this mess, not me. For the first time in years, I chose myself. I blocked any remaining contacts from Charlie's family, set my phone down, and exhaled. I was free of their drama. Finally, I felt a strange sense of relief. It hurt to walk away, but I knew that moving forward meant putting them behind me completely. It was time to take back control of my own life. A few months passed quietly after I blocked Charlie and everyone connected to him. It was a strange adjustment at first. After years of trying to keep everything together, the quiet felt both freeing and unsettling. But each day that went by, I felt more like myself. I'd wake up without that knot in my stomach, without the anxiety that had crept into my life after I'd started to suspect Charlie was hiding things. I'd walk into my kitchen and feel a sense of peace that hadn't been there in a long time. It didn't take long for mutual friends to start catching me up on what was happening with Charlie and Sarah. I didn't ask for updates, but as people do, they just couldn't help themselves. The first piece of news was about Charlie. Word had it that Sandy hadn't stuck around after I left. Apparently, their affair had only been thrilling while it was a secret, but once they didn't have to hide anymore, things fizzled fast. Sandy moved on almost immediately, ghosting Charlie completely. It didn't take long for her to find someone else, and from what I heard, she was already living a new life. Charlie had thrown everything away for her, me, his daughter's trust, and in the end, he got left with nothing. But that wasn't even the half of it. Things had fallen apart between him and Sarah, too. Without me around to smooth things over, they were starting to face the consequences of their choices. Sarah blamed Charlie for everything, the breakup, the fallout, her canceled party, and Charlie? From what I heard, he was no help at all. He wasn't offering any support or taking responsibility. Instead, he acted like it was all just too much to deal with. The man who'd always relied on me to handle the messy parts was now left without a single person willing to do that for him. The tension between them got worse. Sarah started acting out. She skipped school, stayed out late, and fell in with a crowd that didn't care about school or anything that would have kept her life on track. She was furious at her dad for ruining her plans, and angry at me for cutting her off. She didn't seem to understand that her own choices had played a part in all of this. Eventually, things got so bad that Sarah moved out. She packed her things and went to live with her mom, the same mom she'd always complained about when she was with us. It felt ironic. The girl who'd spent years saying how she'd rather be anywhere than her mom's was now left with no other choice. But I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd made her decisions, and now she had to live with them, just like I'd had to. In the months that followed, Charlie kept losing. He wasn't just a man who'd lost his relationship with me. He'd managed to break his relationship with his own daughter. From what I heard, Sarah hardly spoke to him anymore. And without me or Sarah, he had no one left. He'd gambled everything on his lies, and now he was facing the loss head-on. The man who thought he could juggle me, Sandy, and his lies, who thought he could keep everyone happy while living his double life, was finally facing the wreckage he'd caused. The strange part was that I didn't feel much satisfaction from it all. Maybe in a different story I would have felt a sense of justice, of karma, watching Charlie's life crumble the way mine had under his betrayal. But I just felt tired. I didn't need revenge or closure. It was enough to know that I'd taken myself out of their mess. One day, about 6 months after everything had gone down, I ran into one of Charlie's friends at a coffee shop. We'd always been on good terms, but I hadn't spoken to her since the breakup, so I figured it would be a little awkward. But to my surprise, she was happy to see me. We ended up sitting down for a coffee, and soon enough she brought up Charlie. I could tell she wanted to say something, so I just let her talk. "Charlie's been a mess since you left," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "I don't know what he was thinking, but whatever he thought he had with Sandy wasn't real. It fell apart the second you were out of the picture. Now he's completely lost. Sandy's gone, and Sarah barely speaks to him. She shook her head, looking almost disappointed. "You know, I always thought he didn't deserve you, but I hoped he'd step up. Clearly, that was too much to ask." I nodded, not sure what to say. I didn't feel any joy in hearing that he was struggling, but it did bring me a sense of peace to know that, at least, I'd made the right choice to leave. Her expression softened, and she added, "Honestly, I think Sarah's the one who got hurt the most. She's lashing out at everyone, blaming Charlie for what happened, and blaming you for cutting her off. I don't think she realizes that her own choices put her in this situation too. That stung a little. I'd always known Sarah would feel betrayed when I left, but part of me had hoped that she'd understand in time why I couldn't stay. It was hard to accept that she didn't see things that way, and that she still felt entitled to the kindness and support I'd once offered. After we said goodbye, I walked out of that coffee shop feeling surprisingly light. For the first time in months, I felt like I'd left it all behind. Hearing about the aftermath was like hearing about strangers' lives, people I didn't really know or care about anymore, and in a way, that was exactly what they'd become. I took a deep breath as I walked down the street, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. This was a new beginning, and I was ready to step into it without looking back. The weight of the past was gone, and for the first time, I felt the freedom of choosing myself. Months passed, and life settled into a new normal. After years of feeling like I was constantly holding things together for others, I finally had time to focus on myself. I found new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. I didn't want to dwell on Charlie or Sarah anymore. They had become memories, echoes from a life I had willingly left behind. But life has a funny way of circling back around when you least expect it. One day I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated to answer, expecting it might be someone trying to sell me insurance or asking for donations. But something nudged me to pick up. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, and then I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, it's Sarah." I wasn't sure how to feel. It had been nearly a year since I'd left, since I'd cut ties with her and her father. Part of me wanted to hang up to avoid opening any old wounds, but a bigger part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. So I stayed silent, waiting. Look, I know I hurt you, she started, her voice soft and a little shaky. "I know I betrayed you by keeping things from you about Dad and Sandy, and I'm not calling to make excuses. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I could tell it took a lot for her to say that. She'd always been proud, independent, and a little headstrong, and I knew that admitting fault wasn't easy for her. "Thank you for saying that, Sarah," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "I appreciated you reaching out, but I needed time away from all of it. There was a long silence on the line before she spoke again, sounding more vulnerable than I'd ever heard her. "After you left, things got really bad. Dad and we couldn't talk without fighting. I tried to hate you, tried to blame you for walking away, but honestly, I know now that you didn't have a choice. I was just so mad at everyone, but mostly at myself. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I wish I'd been braver. I wish I'd told you about everything sooner. I thought I was protecting Dad, and maybe even you, but looking back, I just didn't want to be the one to break it all. But I see now that by not telling you, I only made things worse." I listened, a strange blend of emotions flooding over me. I had spent so long being angry, hurt, and disappointed. But hearing her voice, hearing the raw honesty in her words, I felt something else. Empathy. Sarah, I understand why you felt that way. You were put in an impossible position, and you were just a kid trying to make sense of it all. "But I can't pretend that it didn't hurt," I replied, feeling my own voice shake slightly. I cared about you like my own, and it broke me to know you kept those secrets. Even if you thought it was for the best. She sniffled a bit, and I could tell she was holding back tears. I know, and that's why I wanted to call. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm trying to make things right with myself, and maybe someday with you too. There was so much I could say, so much I'd held on to for the past year. But instead, I kept it simple. I appreciate your honesty, Sarah. I hope you're able to find peace, and I hope you keep learning to stand up for what's right. I don't know if we can go back to how things were, but I wish you all the best. She whispered a quiet thank you before hanging up, and I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear, letting the silence settle around me. Her apology didn't change the past, and it didn't erase the pain I'd gone through, but somehow it felt like a small step forward. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking back to our conversation. I hadn't realized how much I needed that closure until I'd finally received it. For so long, I'd felt betrayed, used, and discarded. And while Sarah's apology didn't heal everything, it allowed me to feel some compassion, to release a bit of the bitterness that I'd held on to. As the year came to a close, I began to feel a new kind of peace. I wasn't just moving on from Charlie and Sarah. I was growing from the experience. I'd learned a lot about boundaries, trust, and the importance of standing up for myself. And most importantly, I'd learned that choosing myself didn't make me selfish or heartless. It made me strong. In time, I even started dating again. I took things slow, cautious about letting someone new into my life. But each time I laughed with friends, went out for a casual coffee, or sat at home reading a book without feeling anxious, I was reminded of how far I'd come. I had learned to live for myself, and I wasn't about to give that up for anyone. So in the end, what could have broken me only made me stronger. I wasn't the same person I was when I met Charlie, and that was okay. I'd faced betrayal, heartbreak, and a sense of loss, but I'd come out on the other side wiser, more resilient, and finally, at peace. And for me, that was the greatest victory of all. Story 2. I caught my girlfriend having an affair with my closest buddy. She surprises me 5 years later, just before my wedding. Everything between me, my ex-girlfriend Jane, and my former roommate and purported buddy Ted essentially fell apart when I was 29. Although Jane and I had been dating for some time and it wasn't ideal, I never suspected that anything fishy was happening. Not directly in front of my face anyhow. Perhaps there were clues in hindsight, such as her laughing a bit too much at his ridiculous jokes, or her spending time in his room watching movies on his large television. However, I dismissed it because, well, I trusted them. I suppose we've learned our lesson. They were both acting strangely when I arrived home from work one evening. Too pleasant, as if they were making an excessive effort to act as though nothing was wrong. Jane offered to prepare dinner for me, but she never did. Ted also wanted to know if I wanted to go have a burger or whatever. I didn't give it much thought at the time, but it seemed strange, as if they were both attempting to overcompensate and felt guilty. Since I was exhausted and assumed they were in a nice mood or something, I accepted it. Then one evening, the truth was revealed in the most terrible manner. At around 2 a.m, I was sound sleeping when my phone buzzed with a text from Kyle, a mutual acquaintance. Jane was discussing with one of her pals how she and Ted had been hooking up for months in a snapshot of a chat. Months. My mind was racing. Though I knew Kyle wouldn't lie about anything like that, I still wanted to think it was some kind of sick joke. "Dude, I thought you should know," he said. That concluded everything. I recall feeling nauseous as I simply stared at the television. It seemed like every joyful moment I'd shared with Jane, and my hands were shaking. And Ted and I stopped hanging out late every night. I mean, here was the girl I was going to pop the question to, and the friend I was going to allow stay with us while he recovered. I felt foolish. A few minutes later, I made the decision to face them. I raced out my room and headed directly for Ted's door. I didn't knock at all. I simply flung it open. As if they were two remorseful children caught with their hands in the cookie jar, they were seated together on his bed. I could tell everything from the expressions on their faces. Jane stutteringly said that it just happened and that she wanted to tell me just how I was taught to think it would. That sort of shit. Everything seemed to be moving slowly to me. There was shouting. I can hardly recall half of what I said. All I knew was that I was angry. Ted made an effort to appear tough, telling me that it didn't matter because, in his opinion, Jane and I weren't working out anyhow. Jane simply sat there, seemed on the verge of tears. But to be honest, I didn't give a damn. If she was so dissatisfied, she had months to talk to me, months to finish things rather than continue with their current course of action. I instructed them both to go when things began to cool down. That is, as much as they could under the circumstances. Where they went didn't matter to me. All I wanted was to get rid of them. Ted made an effort to speak with me, claiming that he didn't intend for things to go this bad, as if that improved things in any way. Jane, however, persisted in stating that she never intended this to occur. I suppose they were making excuses and doing everything they could to cheer me up. However, nothing they said could make things better. I had to be somewhere other than that place that night, so I ended up sleeping on a friend's couch. After getting 0 hours of sleep the next morning, I made the decision to permanently go. Naturally, they were both still at the apartment when I returned to get my belongings. Jane pretended that she never wanted to lose me as a friend in an attempt to dissuade me from leaving. But this was a joke because friends don't act in such a way. I didn't even attempt to pack things neatly. I just tossed whatever I could into boxes and bags. All I wanted was to get out. Like the coward he is, Ted avoided making eye contact as he stood in the corner. When I was finished, I told them both that I would never again want to interact with them. Though I didn't stay to hear it, Jane seemed to want to say something. I simply walked away without turning around. I was done with them and the entire situation after that. Sincerely, I assumed our common acquaintances would learn about it eventually, so I kept it a secret. This is the bit that hurt the most, though. They were indifferent. Although several expressed regret about the turmoil, they ultimately decided to maintain their friendship with Jane and Ted. It just validated what I had to do, but I wasn't sure if I should laugh or be angry. I disconnected them all, each and every one. I returned to my home state, deleted all of my social media accounts, changed my phone number, and essentially vanished from that circle of friends. At first it seemed cruel, as though I was abandoning all I knew, but I knew I had to do it. If I continued to hang on to those who didn't support me, I would never be able to go on. I never looked back after letting go of everything, not even once. It was challenging, particularly initially. On certain days, I thought that perhaps I was being too severe or allowing my rage to rule me. However, every time I considered making contact, I would recall that evening and how they both gave me the impression that I was the one who didn't belong. As if I were upsetting some romantic fantasy they had conjured up. Really, it wasn't me who was skulking about and deceiving folks. After then, life wasn't always ideal. I had a difficult time trying to start over on my own, but I gradually made new acquaintances, put my career back on track and began to advance. I gradually created a life of which I was proud. After a while, I got to know Ashley. Everything Jane wasn't, she is. Sincere, devoted, and yes, respectful of the others in her life. She was aware of my background and accepted things as they were. That was respected by her. All of it was behind me, and I never made an effort to resurrect it. And I truly began to feel joyful again with her. Years after the fact, here I was. I'm miles away from the turmoil and engaged to the most incredible woman I've ever seen. I believed that I had permanently moved past all of that baggage. However, it turns out that I was mistaken. Ted and Jane weren't done with me yet. Okay, so I'm at last in a nice position, isn't it? Following the events involving Jane and Ted, I severed all connections, put that catastrophe behind me, and went on with my life. Since Ashley and I were blissfully engaged, I honestly believed that chapter would be closed forever. However, as it happens, that was not going to be the case. It all began with a single, straightforward post. Although I'm not too active on social media, I thought it would be a good idea to share some positive news. I thus shared a photo of Ashley and I, along with a brief note announcing our engagement. Just a little picture of us smiling, nothing overly ostentatious. I assumed that some of my family members and the few friends I still stay in touch with would enjoy it. However, that's all. I had no idea that post would be the catalyst for all of the past turmoil to resurface in my life. I received a notification of a random message a few days after I submitted. When I looked at my phone, I saw that Jane had left me a message. I nearly dropped my phone. I mean, she suddenly chooses to make a comeback after years of complete silence. I didn't even crack it open. All of my previous emotions returned as soon as I looked at her name. The betrayal, the rage, everything. My first instinct was to remove it. For a moment, though, I sat there, trying to understand why she would reach out. I didn't need any closure or anything since I hadn't thought about her in a long time, and I was content with Ashley. I didn't want to hear her side of the story. Her justifications? Nothing. I had long since made peace. I blocked her without reading the message. The issue has been resolved, correct? That is, I believed. That evening I informed Ashley about it. I didn't want us to have any secrets, particularly with anything that seemed like a strange throwback. I did the right thing just in case she blocked Jane too, she remarked, laughing it off. That should be the end of it, we both thought. Jane was able to go on after finding closure or whatever it was. Then, however, the phony profile began to appear. Since I'm not really active on social media, I didn't notice at first. However, Ashley was receiving strange friend requests from accounts that had no posts and a generic profile picture. However, because she is intelligent, she rejected all of them. She began to suspect it was Jane after a few, and I was compelled to concur. Who else, after all, would be that tenacious? To be honest, it was more frustrating than anything else. Jane was playing games and vying for my attention as if we were still in high school, which made me think about her more than I had in a long time. In the end, I just made the decision to remove all of my social media accounts. If she was only going to use it to prod me, there was no need in keeping it around. I reasoned that she would be forced to remove it before I deactivated my account if I wasn't online. One of her phony personas eventually messaged me personally, so I replied a brief message. I informed her that I didn't want anything to do with her and that she should leave me alone. I didn't even wait for her to answer. I immediately blocked her after hitting send. I then deleted the entire account. Done correctly at last. I assumed she would pick up on it and go on with her life. However, no, not even near. Jane apparently chose to avoid me completely once I closed my accounts. My sister Mandy unexpectedly contacted me a few days later. Despite our strong relationship, Mandy and I don't often communicate on a daily basis. I assumed that she was only phoning to talk or inquire about the arrangements for the engagement. However, I could tell something was wrong since she sounded serious. She simply left before I had a chance to say hi. Hey, I have a strange subject to discuss with you. Great, I'm thinking. Now what? She begins by explaining to me how Jane had contacted her, and more than a simple "hello, how are you" message, Jane allegedly started telling me that I had a son right away. Yes, what you just read is true, a son. Initially, I chuckled. It was absurd, really. I informed Mandy that she was most likely only attempting to attract attention. Mandy wasn't laughing, though. She claimed that Jane sounded rather needy and was sincere. Jane persisted even after Mandy attempted to dismiss her. She had emailed her photos of this child and commented on how much he resembled me. She was talking about how she never wanted to hide this and so forth. I didn't purchase it. In my opinion, this was Jane's desperate attempt to capture my interest. She had years to come forward, after all, if this were true. If I owned this child, she would have tried to get in touch with me for child support, wouldn't she? Or at least let me know when she became pregnant? I didn't get it. I also mentioned this to Mandy, but she said that Jane was rather obstinate. It was even more strange since I could see Mandy wasn't sure what to believe either. My brain was screwed up by the whole event. I made an effort to dismiss it as just another of Jane's falsehoods, but I couldn't help but wonder what may have happened. For example, what if she was speaking the truth? I wasn't exactly in the mood to believe anything she said, and the timing felt far too convenient. Nevertheless, you cannot ignore the prospect of having a child for the next several days. I was unable to concentrate. My thoughts would go back to Jane and her alleged son while I was at work. Ashley started asking me whether I was okay after seeing that I was acting strangely. I pretended that I was struggling with some work-related stress since I didn't want to include her in the mess. But really, my thoughts were scattered. It didn't set well to think that a child, my child, would be out there. I finally came to the conclusion that I couldn't ignore it. The last thing I wanted was for Jane to somehow knock on our door. There has to be some way for me to end this for good. I thus contacted a lawyer. Although I didn't want to deal with her directly, I reasoned that a lawyer could issue an official letter telling her to stop. All I wanted was for her to leave my life. There will be no more drama or games. I didn't need my past to hold me back from Ashley and me as we moved forward. I told the lawyer about all of the communications, the phony profiles, and, in the end, the message that said, "I have a son." He said he will take care of it after listening and nodding. He promised to write her a letter requesting evidence of her sincerity and requesting that she leave me alone if she didn't giving it to someone else was a relief. I felt that this was finally going to be resolved with the lawyer engaged since I didn't want to deal with Jane myself. I felt like a weight had finally been lifted when I enlisted the help of the lawyer because I assumed this would finally be finished. I believed that I had had enough of Jane's bullshit. I assumed that she would get the letter and be persuaded to withdraw. However, the lawyer phones me a few days later and says he has to meet with me to talk about the matter. I assumed he would simply inform me. Jane took a step back. I felt quite at ease when I entered his office. He took a seat for me. First gave me an envelope without saying anything. There were photos inside, including a few of a little child. The child looked just like me, and I'm not sure how else to put it. Looking at an old photo of myself when I was younger was unsettling. Same eyes, same dark hair, even a smile like that. I just sat there, confused and angry at the same time, looking. According to my lawyer, Jane provided him these photos as evidence, along with a memo outlining the chronology. She claims that shortly after I saw her and Ted together, she became pregnant, although both she and Ted believed the child was theirs. She stated that they didn't speak to me since they simply continued living their lives, believing Ted to be the father. They didn't discover Ted was infertile until later, when they attempted to conceive more children. Seemingly that's when their misgivings began to surface. Let me tell you the truth. I still harbored the suspicion that this was some kind of complex ruse. It simply felt too convenient, and Jane had never really been reliable. However, it was difficult to argue with the pictures. The child's looks were unique to me. However, without concrete evidence, I wasn't going to believe her. I thus instructed my attorney to set up a DNA test. Before I could even begin to comprehend what was occurring, I needed something tangible. It was cruel to wait for the findings. I could hardly concentrate on anything else, and each day seemed to drag on for a week. Ashley was supportive, but I could see she was concerned, so I informed her what was happening so she wouldn't be in the dark. This wasn't just any old drama after all. Everything would be different if this child were mine. But she remained by my side, telling me that we would deal with whatever came up. The findings eventually arrived after what seemed like an eternity. "It's a match," my lawyer informed me over the phone. I was unsure about how to feel. Relief, startle, fury. A combination of all of it, perhaps. I had recently learned that I had a son that I had never been aware of, a boy who had grown up believing Ted was his dad. They were unaware of my identity. Learning that you are a father is one thing. Realizing that you missed your child's first 5 years of existence because someone concealed it from you is another matter entirely. My mind was racing. I made an effort to comprehend that I had a son and that this young guy was mine. But then almost instantly Ted was on my mind. How would he react to all of this? Knowing that it might not be his and Jane's child, he raised my child as his own. In order to at least warn me, she had to come clean for years. However, she chose to keep it hidden and finally came out after realizing how well I was doing. It was hard to avoid feeling taken advantage of. As if she had only gotten in touch since my life appeared to be improving on paper. I wasn't the focus, and the child wasn't the focus either. She just chose to seize the chance when she spotted it. My wrath was further heightened by that knowledge, which felt like a kick to the belly. However, I also had to consider my kid and what this meant for him. I wasn't going to leave him because his parents had misled me, and he didn't ask to be involved in this mess. I instructed my attorney to contact Jane and Ted and inform them that I would indeed be active in my son's life. I was more than happy to pay child support, and I wanted the ability to visit. After everything they'd concealed, I wasn't going to allow them to set the terms any longer. However, Ted lost it when my lawyer brought up visitation. Ted claimed to be the child's biological father and didn't want me near his son, according to what my lawyer informed me. Talk about boldness, I mean. The man raises my son without speaking to me, cheats on me with my girlfriend, and now tries to act as though I don't exist. I was furious. I instructed my attorney to inform Ted that I am more than just a sporadic check in the mail if I am paying child support. My son would have to deal with me whether he liked it or not. Jane naturally intervened, attempting to mediate the situation. She said we could arrange a payment plan, but perhaps visits might be covert to save the child from being confused. I refused to accept it. They had best be ready to allow me to be there as his father if they wanted money. It's simple. In the event that they declined, I would open a savings account for my kid and provide him access to it at his 18th birthday. However, I refused to comply with whatever perverse arrangement they had in mind. The whole thing seemed unreal. I was prepared to become a father, something I never imagined I'd have to consider so quickly, and I only received backlash. I was unable to comprehend their reasoning. They didn't want me involved, but they did want my money, as though I were only a wallet they could draw from whenever it was convenient for them. It seemed as though they were attempting to selectively select the aspects of me that they want in their lives. I wasn't going to put up with it. I made the decision to exert more effort. I instructed my attorney to state unequivocally that I would seek full visitation rights or any other rights I might have as his biological father if I were to pay child support. I refused to be reduced to a supporting role in my son's life by them. And they wouldn't receive any money from me if they didn't agree. I would rather put money aside for my son's future than give them power over this. During every guilt trip in the book, Jane and Ted accused me of being self-centered and claiming that I was only attempting to destroy their family. To be honest, it's absurd coming from the two individuals who beat me like a full kid. Selfish. They were, if anything, the self-centered ones who pretended to be this picture-perfect family while being aware of the reality the entire time. So here I am, prepared to defend my son. Although I have no idea how this will turn out, I do know one thing. They can't force me to leave his life. They may have prevented me from seeing him for 5 years, but I will not allow them to do it again. We started talking seriously about what I could achieve here when I told my lawyer that I was in this for the long run. Legally speaking, it's more complicated than you may imagine. Ted and Jane were ahead by 5 years. Ted was also regarded as the legal father because he was included on the birth certificate. Even if I'm the biological father in these kinds of cases, my lawyer clarified, it's not easy to just come in and obtain complete rights. It was going to require a great deal of patience, money, and time. I'm not very good at it. Ted and Jane also made things difficult. Ted wouldn't even sit down when my lawyer tried to schedule a meeting to talk about visitation. In a lengthy, dramatic email, he said that he is the only father my son has ever known and that he didn't want to interfere with the child's life by sharing it with me. In fact, he used the word disturb, as if my kid was working on a project and he didn't want me to ruin it. Jane continued to attempt to find some strange middle ground in the meanwhile. She said I could come see my son, but only if I agreed to her conditions. She wanted me to consent to seeing him, ideally without Ted there, perhaps once every several months. It seems that the intention was to keep things low-key so the child wouldn't be perplexed by his father's identity. Here's the problem, though. His father is me, both ethically and biologically. I refuse to be forced into a covert supporting position in my own child's life. I informed my attorney that I didn't agree with their terms. Either they allowed me to be his father, or I refused to pay them any money. No matter how hard they tried to make it seem logical, they couldn't have it both ways. They flipped out, as was to be expected. All of a sudden, Jane started sending me guilt-ridden letters about how my refusal to make financial contributions was harming my kid. Ted, on the other side, was being quite possessive and messaging me to claim that I was just there to avoid being haunted by my previous transgressions. Errors. My son was not an error. If anything, the only error in this situation was initially placing your faith in any of them. As a result, my attorney spent weeks corresponding with them. Attempts to blame me, shame me, and get me to quit up were all mixed together in these emails. But my son didn't know me yet every time I sat there thinking about him. However, I wanted him to know that I battled to be in his life when he was old enough. Writing checks and seeing another person perform the part was not my plan. I should have had that. We finally persuaded them to agree to a sit-down meeting after what seemed like an eternity. It was really weird. Jane arrived first, appearing nervous as if she were going to go before a corporate board or something. A few minutes later, Ted entered, sat down, and crossed his arms as if in mute protest without even looking at me. You could have sliced the energy in that room with a knife because it was that thick. Jane began to speak, explaining that she had only kept this a secret because she believed it would be beneficial, for the best. With my voice scarcely stable, I questioned her. How was it best to keep a child away from his father for 5 years? She stumbled through an explanation that she didn't want to complicate matters by including me, and that she believed Ted to be his father. Ted eventually decided to speak, and when he did, he was in full defense mode. I brought him up. He learned how to ride his bike from me. I've supported you through every school project and every scraped knee, he continued, as if I were some trespasser attempting to take his child. The problem is that I understand. He's been there. He's done the fatherly things. However, that does not negate the fact that I am the biological father and should have the opportunity to attend as well. Hours passed during our back and forth arguments until it seemed like we were repeating ourselves. What's best for us was what they truly meant, but they kept coming back to the concept of what's best for him. They wanted me out of sight and in the background. Only the bank account they could access at any time. Well, we don't want to confuse him, but the kid is 5 years old, they said again. He will ultimately get interested in me. How long did they intend to continue this? My attorney finally intervened and outlined our demands. It goes without saying that I would need to be granted frequent visitation if they desired child support. It quote as simple. Ted appeared to be about to blow up, but I wasn't going to back down. They were no longer the focus of this. My son and my right to be involved in his life were at issue. In a circumstance, if I was his biological father, I couldn't tolerate being treated like a third wheel. Perhaps we could revisit the idea in a year or two, Jane said after trying one more play. I was done making concessions once my son was more accustomed to things. I promised to open a savings account for him if I didn't have equitable visitation. Rather, when he reached 18, he would know that I made an effort to be there and have that money ready for him. I refused to just provide for their family while they acted as like I didn't exist. Jane quote S face dropped as I said that, and I could see she hadn't anticipated my firmness. Perhaps she assumed that in order to save myself the trouble, I would just pay up. However, it was not going to occur. Because it was more convenient for them, I wasn't going to be some faraway ghost in my son's life. I wanted him to understand who I was, that I was there, and that I was willing to stand up for him. To put it mildly, it was disheartening that the conference concluded without any genuine conclusion. However, I felt that I had made my position clear when I left. They were aware that despite their desire, I would not just fade into the background. They would also need to contribute a bit if they desired my financial assistance. I felt a mixture of grief and rage as I left that room. Sadness, because in a perverse sense, Ted was correct, and anger because of what they had me go through. Nothing I did would erase the fact that he had been there for those years when I couldn't be. That did not, however, imply that I would give up. Whether they liked it or not, my son was going to have me in his life. I was exhausted yet resolute after that tough encounter. By that point, it was obvious that Ted and Jane would make this as challenging as they could. However, I was aware that I couldn't simply abandon my son. I wasn't going to allow them to dictate how I would become involved because the stakes were too high. To be honest, though, I was becoming frustrated. Their reluctance seemed to obstruct every step they took ahead. After a few weeks, everything was largely calm. I was willing to go to court if necessary, and my lawyer and I were still trying to formally arrange visiting rights. The inconvenience no longer mattered to me. All I wanted was to support my son. However, Jane then attempted a different strategy, a message, this time without any legal issues. I was surprised that she sent it straight to me instead of my lawyer. She seemed to be attempting to speak directly to me, looking for a point of agreement, or perhaps persuade me to alter my position. I was taken aback by the warm tone of her communication. She added something like, I've been thinking about things, and I know that this has been difficult for you as well. She continued by saying that she had no intention of hurting me at the time, and that, in some perverse manner, she believed she was acting in our son's best interests. She went on to say that Ted was still struggling to come to terms with the situation and was intimidated by my abrupt appearance. To be honest, I had some doubts about whether she was sincerely attempting to put things right. The other side of me, however, knew better. She didn't suddenly become morally upright overnight. For years, she had kept my kid concealed from me. She only came clean when it was convenient for her, and she let Ted play D&D. Her reply didn't feel so much like an apology as it did like another angle she was pursuing. Nevertheless, I continued reading because I was curious to see where she was taking it. She then made what I believed to be her main argument. She proposed a middle ground. She added that if I promised to keep our connection to a few visits per year and not tell our kid who I really was, she might see me having a relationship with him. She referred to it as an opportunity to maintain everyone's peace. By giving me this small part in my own son's life, while maintaining Ted as the primary character, she gave the impression that she was doing me a favor. I immediately threw aside whatever consideration I could have had about giving her the benefit of the doubt. A few annual trips and a quiet job. I had no intention of being a glorified uncle to my own son. If she believed that I would accept that. She obviously didn't know me. I responded with a succinct and straightforward statement. I am his father if I am paying child support, for a period. Accept it or reject it. I assumed that communication was over when she didn't respond. Just when I thought things were cooling off, a few more days passed. Ted gave a call. I hadn't really heard his voice in years until now, and I must admit that it made me feel angry, but I made myself remain composed and listen to him. He began by stating that he wanted to set the record straight and that he believed we could resolve this as adults. Despite my reservations, I continued to listen. He acknowledged that he had found the entire thing difficult to handle and that he was attempting to accept it. He went so far as to say that he respected that. I wanted to take the initiative and get active. Then he reached the crux of the matter. He said that he was worried that my involvement might confuse our son and give him the impression that he had two fathers, which Ted felt was unhealthy for a child of his age. I quote, "I'll be honest. His 'let's work this out like adults' approach nearly got me." However, the more he spoke, the more it became obvious that his goal was to convince me to back off. He had no desire to establish common ground. With me in the background, he wanted to maintain everything just the way he wanted it. I interrupted him in the middle of his statement and informed him bluntly, "I'm going to be a part of his life if I'm going to be paying. I'm not here to make your or Jane's life easier. It has to do with my son." Ted attempted to interrupt again, claiming that I was destroying a family, but I refused to listen. I thought it was probably the last time we would be able to talk politely, so I hung up. If it could be called that at all. Then there was silence once more. However, I was aware that the following actions would be lawful. I just concentrated on being ready for whatever battle they would throw at me next during what seemed like an odd lull before the storm. I wasn't giving up, though. Instead of being a ghost or sporadic presence in my son's life, I was going to be a true father to him. Ashley, meantime, was my pillar of support. Even when it seemed like everyone was against me, she helped me stay grounded and reminded me that I was doing morally. She supported Jane and Ted with every update, tense discussion, and novel strategy they explored. Without her, I couldn't have survived it. Ashley said something that truly resonated with me one evening while we were discussing the future. "Your son will one day appreciate you for struggling to be there," she added, "and he deserves to know the true you." What I needed to hear was right there. There was no desire for vengeance or to exact revenge on Jane and Ted. It was about my son and letting him know that his true father was concerned enough to defend him. Here I am, still struggling, still awaiting the outcome of the legal proceedings. I have no idea how long it will take or what challenges they will provide me with next, but I am certain that I will not give up. When my kid learns the truth, he will realize that I made every effort to be in his life. Although the path has been difficult, I wouldn't alter a thing. Because he's worth the effort in the end. We eventually came to a compromise after months of back and forth court hearings and more annoyance than I can express. I would have regular visitation privileges and be able to spend time with my son without having to worry about Jane and Ted's regulations. It wasn't the ideal result I was hoping for. In every sense, I wanted to be his father. But that was something, considering the situation. The initial visit seemed unreal. We had decided to meet in the park, and I recall standing outside of it. Like I was meeting him for the first time, my heart was racing. And I was, in a sense, when he rushed toward me. It seemed like everything suddenly made sense at one point. I recognized myself in him. The same wild energy, the same inquisitive gaze. I suppose my smile didn't go away the whole time. Like any other child, he showed me everything he enjoyed while we played, spoke, and giggled. And I felt like I was a part of his life for an hour or two. As if I were his father. It quote S not simple. I still have to cope with the restrictions set by Jane and Ted, and I still have to see them. And occasionally I feel as though I haven't really gotten to know him. But every time I see him, I feel like he's becoming more approachable. I'm more than just a stranger now. He is aware that I am his father, even though he hasn't really grasped it yet. Ted and Jane, meantime, are pursuing their own interests. I believe they're beginning to realize that I'm here to stay, that whether they like it or not, I will always be a part of this child's life. They respect it, but they don't have to like it. And for now, that's plenty. Throughout everything, Ashley has been my pillar of support. She has also come to know my son, and I'm even more convinced that she's the one after witnessing her with him. Our wedding is being planned, and although I'm not yet able to be his full-time father, I hope to have him by my side someday. When he gets older, he may serve as my best man. Beside me, as an actual member of my family. The conclusion is not a happy one. I will never be able to reclaim those initial 5 years. However, every visit, every giggle, and every time he refers to me as Dad, even in his own small way, makes the entire argument worthwhile. And I might tell him the entire tale when he's old enough. Not to force him to choose a side, but to let him know that I battled to be there from the beginning. And as long as he has me, I will continue to be there. I was 12 when my father wed his new bride. By that time, Mom had been gone for around 4 years. In all honesty, it seemed strange to see Dad with someone else, and I was still getting accustomed to the thought of her being gone. The new wife appeared to be well enough and wasn't horrible at all. However, when she moved in with her little daughter, everything was different. The young child, who was about 2 or 3 years old, was the focus of their universe from the beginning. All of a sudden, she became the center of attention in our home. It wasn't like I was thrilled to be thrown into this new family. I was still coping with the loss of my mother. I was still figuring things out 4 years after my mother's death. Dad never really talked about it, but I would catch him staring at me almost like he felt bad. We only went through the motions of attempting to fit in as a family, but it felt uncomfortable, as if we were all acting as though nothing was wrong. My mother's engagement ring, however, was the only item I still possessed of her. Our family has owned that ring for many generations. She received it from my grandmother, who had always maintained that it was destined to be handed along. I was holding on to the last remnant of her. I could hold on to some family history. It was a bit too large for my fingers, so I put it on a necklace. It served as a small reminder that my mother was still with me every time I looked at it. The youngster was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer almost a year after the father remarried and the daughter of his new wife. Back then, I wasn't really sure what that meant, but I knew it was serious. The atmosphere in the house changed from strained to simply depressing. Everything revolved around her medical appointments, therapies, and any other requirements she might have. Everyone was at the hospital, so when I would get home from school, nobody was there. Most evenings, I would eat by myself, hearing the house's silence, and generally felt further alienated. Then one day, with that serious expression on his face, Dad sat me down in the living room. Although it wasn't accessible in the area, he informed me that they had discovered an experimental therapy that could benefit the girl. The expenses were outrageous, and they would have to spend many months somewhere else. Due to their limited finances and the absence of his new wife's family, they were searching for alternative sources of funding. He asked whether we might sell Mom's engagement ring after giving me a serious look. At first, I didn't get it. For example, how was that related to anything? In her will, she left me the ring, which was mine. There was more than simply ostentatious jewelry to sell. At times, it seemed to be all that remained of her. I informed him so, and Doctor sighed before stating that this therapy may save her life. It quote, "It's not as though it's only for amusement." I recall sitting there and looking at him, wondering whether he truly believed that taking something away from me was okay. He made an effort to claim that it was for the greater benefit, that the goal was to save a life. Yes, I get that, but I was just 13 at the time, and he was requesting that I give up the one item that still linked me to my mother. When I attempted to express it to him, he labeled me selfish, and I wasn't sure how to do it without coming out as such. Since he would be taking something away from me that I would never get back, I informed him that I wouldn't forgive him if he sold it. He didn't listen, though. The ring was gone the next thing I knew, sold for $14,000. It just took him $14,000 to sell out, my mother's final possession. Later, he attempted to discuss it with me, but I refused to listen. It seemed to me that he had just taken something that wasn't his, something he would never comprehend that meant far more to me. Things were strange between us after that. I started to distance myself from him and become more private. It seemed like I was seeing him live this new life without me when I saw him with his wife and their children. I could feel my fury rising every time I glanced at him. I would feel like screaming at him to express my hatred for what he had done. However, I suppressed it. It didn't matter, I thought. He had already decided. I just tried to concentrate on friends and school for a time, anything to divert my attention. However, the sense of betrayal persisted. I would feel alienated in my own home every day when I saw them all together. That ring was only the last indication that he had already decided to choose his new family over me. Even when they would leave me alone at home to attend to her medical appointments. It was not as though I was relieved. I was only in this home, surrounded by memories that no one else cared about. I stopped discussing anything significant with him. I only provide brief responses when he asks about school. When he attempted to organize a joint activity, I would dismiss him, acting as though I wasn't interested or busy. I had a part of me hoping he would see, understand what he had done, and say sorry. However, he never did. He would continue to act as if nothing were wrong, and attempt to make things work. I was already making plans for my escape by the time I was almost 18. I was aware that I had to leave that house. It was like a new wound every time I remembered how he had sold Mom's ring. It seemed as if he had put the demands of his new family above my right to have a connection to her. I began to save as much as I could, preparing to go. I wanted to leave, a long way from a place that no longer felt like home. Some may argue that I was exaggerating, but when you're 13 and someone takes something so significant away from you, it throws your head for a loop. The ring itself isn't everything. What it stood for is what matters. I was connected to a family through that ring. I had lost the ability to recall my mother in a clear and concise manner. It was like losing her again when I lost it. And nobody knew that. Not my dad in particular. My dad sold the ring, and the years that followed were odd. Maybe I'll get used to it, I thought, as if I'd be able to go on and let it go someday. However, that just did not occur. The contempt and wrath, if anything, continued to grow. Every time I look at my dad, I see the man who stole the one thing my mom had left and gave it away as if it were nothing. The man who chose someone else's child above his own. The fact that I felt like a shadow in their new family throughout those years didn't help either. I quickly realized that I couldn't rely on him for anything, including assistance. On some days, they wouldn't even be there when I got home. I would be left to fend for myself when they were away for a hospital visit or overnight with friends close to the treatment facility. They attempted to set me up with meals and everything, like they'd put frozen dinners in the freezer, or even get a neighbor to check in on me. But it always felt like an afterthought, like they had their priorities and I just wasn't one of them. And let me tell you, it was hard to shake off the sensation of being forgotten. I quote, sit in that lonely home, knowing they were out there trying to help her. And I'd just become angrier, upset that they'd left me to take care of myself. Mostly upset that this was meant to be my home, but also upset that my dad didn't seem to care. It didn't feel like one, though. I felt as though I was a stranger in my own home. Early on, I made the decision that I would leave as quickly as possible. I began taking part-time jobs and saved as much money as I could. I worked as a babysitter and a lawnmower before landing a job at a grocery shop on the weekends and after school. It was something, but not much. I had a straightforward strategy: save enough money and leave when you're 18. I wanted no further reminders of what he had done or what I had lost. Things became much more tense as I reached my final year. Every now and then, my dad would attempt to have these father-daughter conversations in which he expressed his pride in me. How did he know I would achieve great things? However, it sounded like meaningless words at that moment. He couldn't just use a few to make things right because I wasn't some tiny kid anymore. You have my admiration. Remarks. Furthermore, he never expressed regret or acknowledged his mistakes. I waited in the hopes that he may apologize and acknowledge the harm he had caused, but he never did. He seemed to believe that everything was now well, as if he had simply forgotten about everything. So I ought to. He made an attempt to discuss college with me one day, I recall. He inquired as to whether I had considered my educational goals or my intended destination. I told him I didn't know yet and shrugged. In all honesty, I didn't want to discuss my future with him since, in my opinion, he wasn't truly involved. I didn't want him engaged in my plans to move out and start my life on my own terms. I had spent so much time alone. The idea of his attempting to play dad now just felt offensive to me because I'd learnt to be self-sufficient. The tension between us was at an all-time high as graduation drew near. He persisted in attempting to portray us as a typical father and daughter couple, navigating the usual challenges of adolescence. However, we weren't. Not by a long stretch. I was so enraged by him that I couldn't even look at him, and I believe he was aware of it because occasionally he would look at me with a dejected, nearly hopeless face, as if he had lost something but was unable to identify it. I put all of my money aside for my work. I was determined to get out as quickly as possible. Where I went didn't matter to me, only that I would be able to breathe at last. A place where I was not forced to continue living in this peculiar shadow of a family. I became increasingly restless as I approached the age of 18, feeling as though I was counting down the days until I would be free. I recall packing up my belongings in my room the night before I moved out, taking in the walls and reflecting on all the memories I was leaving behind. It was a bittersweet experience. I had spent the best years of my life with my mother here, where I had grown up and called home. However, it was no longer that location. Since he had sold her ring, no, not when he had picked them instead of me. Before I departed, Dad made an effort to speak with me. He appeared to be trying to express something important as he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. But it was all he could do. Despite our disagreements, you will always remain my daughter. I simply nodded, smiled artificially, and remained silent. I was unwilling to argue with him. I didn't want to prolong the farewell in my mind. As soon as Dad sold that ring, he no longer had the right to refer to me as his daughter. Without turning around, I packed my belongings in my car and drove off. I had enough money saved up to rent a modest apartment. Not much. It's a little space that is just large enough to swing a cat. But the most important thing was that it was mine. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. There was no continual reminder of the treachery I had experienced or the family I had lost. I had the opportunity to start afresh, and it was just me and my space. Being alone felt strange at first. It seemed strange to be really independent after so many years of fending for myself. However, as the days went by, I began to establish a routine. I would get up, leave for work, and return home to a pleasant, almost tranquil feeling. Dad and his new family weren't a concern for me. Their drama and the continual reminders of what had transpired were not something I had to cope with. Dad, of course, made an effort to communicate. Occasionally, he would phone and leave lengthy voicemails inquiring about my well-being. He said he missed me. Most of them I disregarded. I would occasionally listen, but just out of interest. A part of me kept hoping he would apologize. Said he wanted to make amends after realizing his mistake. However, the apology never materialized. It was always the same old, "I just want to hear from you," or "I miss you." And as if he was unable to comprehend my reasons for leaving or my refusal to speak with him. A few months later, I was hired for the first time, something that would pay my payments and allow me to keep the flat. I enjoyed the simplicity of life. I didn't need sympathy or assistance. I felt proud to have made it on my own. I didn't know how much leaving had altered me until much later. I was more protective and harder. I understood what it was like to have your most trusted individuals betray you, so I didn't allow them in easy. Nevertheless, a small part of me still desired closure in spite of everything. That was curious as to whether he ever felt sorrow for his actions. However, I had no intention of waiting for that response. I had waited too long for him to act morally and be the father I needed. I had finished it. Moving out was about letting go of everything that had been holding me back, not simply about obtaining my own place. And that was the finest choice I had ever made, in my opinion. I had spent some time alone. I honestly didn't miss them by that point, since I had become accustomed to the freedom and tranquility. Being able to live without worrying about family strife or whether Dad would ever apologize brought a certain freedom. I believed that I had finally moved on from it. Then one day, I get a call from my dad, and it's totally unexpected. He said, "Hello, kiddo," and I had nearly forgotten what it sounded like. He wasted no time in explaining me the cause for his call, that his wife's daughter was ill once more and that the cancer had returned, in that clumsy, phony, happy voice he employed whenever he had terrible news. He sounded tense, as if he were already preparing for the question he would have to pose. And I secretly knew that he had just one purpose for contacting me after all this time. As it happens, I was correct. He was requesting money after all these years had passed. I wasn't apologizing when my own father called, to beg for a handout to assist his new family, not to make amends. He spoke for a long time about how they were struggling financially, and that every little amount would help, since they were drowning in medical costs. Before he remarried, Dad told me about the money he had saved for me. He had saved a few $1,000s for my future when I was young, but it wasn't much. However, he hoped I would help. It was like being slapped across the face. After everything, I asked him directly why he believed I would want to assist. He stammered, as he attempted to clarify that he believed that perhaps enough time had gone by, and that I obviously no longer harbored resentment. He said that I had the opportunity to change things for a good cause, as if all of this were some kind of heroic deed. There isn't another option for him to escape the catastrophe he created. I didn't hold back. I expressed my precise thoughts to him, that after selling my mother's ring, he had no right to ask me for anything. Given that he had never bothered to apologize, I remarked it was offensive that he even believed I would give it any attention. He said that I should let go of the past, and that I was being unreasonable. He seemed sincere in his belief that I was at fault for my anger over the ring. He then began discussing his stepdaughter's illness, claiming that I need to show sympathy for her because she didn't deserve this. I informed him that empathy is reciprocal. After reminding him that he had chosen them above me and my mother's memories, I pretended that everything was all right. I assumed that he had finally understood when he became silent, but I was mistaken. "I wish you could let it go," he added with a sigh. I realized then that he would never truly understand. Then I got a call from his wife. She tried to guilt-trip me by sending emails, leaving voicemails, and sending texts. She would say things like, "We're family. It's about saving a child's life, and it's not about you. We ought to support one another." Honestly, it had the opposite impact of what she had hoped, that somehow bringing up the family card would make me give up. Every message served as a reminder of how they had rejected me as a child. Now that they were in need of money, I was family. However, at the time, I was only a bother that should be ignored. After a period of neglecting her, she attempted something different. She once left me a lengthy message explaining how the ring had saved her daughter's life, and that I should be thankful it was used for something so important. It was so daring that I couldn't even speak. She was genuinely attempting to paint me as the villain because I wanted to preserve my mother's final gift. That one, I didn't even answer. I just blocked her number and erased it. But it didn't stop there. She managed to include the rest of the family somehow. Uncles, aunts, and even cousins who didn't really know me as a child. They all began commenting and sending me direct messages. Others just shared passive-aggressive content about family values and prioritizing others on social media. It was tiring, and it was a circus. In an attempt to find some calm, I ultimately deleted a few of my social media accounts. However, I received a note from my grandma one evening. She generally keeps to herself and is rather laid back, but this time she was obviously drawn into the chaos. She sent this lengthy, uncomfortable note about the importance of family unity and the unbearably difficult period my dad's stepdaughter was going through. I was sick of feeling guilty, yet I felt sorry for her. I replied simply, saying that my dad had already decided on his family when he sold the ring years prior, and that they were short on funds, so he didn't get to come crawling back now. I could see it had hurt when she didn't reply, but I wasn't going to say I was sorry for establishing limits. When I happened to see my dad's wife in public, things reached a new low. She suddenly materialized in the center of the aisle, just in front of me, as I was minding my own thing, picking up some goods. I initially assumed she would simply pass by or act as though she didn't notice me. However, no. She immediately launched into her rant about how self-centered I was and how abhorrent it was that I would even consider retaining the money when her daughter was in critical condition. I had had enough of holding back. She was fortunate that I hadn't filed a lawsuit when my dad sold the ring, I told her, adding that it had meant more to me than she or her daughter could ever know. I reminded her that I had the right to keep the money I had, and that there were other options for assistance if she was in dire need of money. She gave me the devil eyes, murmured something under her breath, and hurried away. People were gazing at me, but I didn't mind. I refused to allow her to coerce me into sacrificing what little security I still had, leaving that shop. I was strangely relieved. I had suppressed my fury for so long that it had been simmering under the surface. But in the end, I defended myself. I had set a boundary, made it clear to her where I stood, and refused to back down. Indeed, that was better than just having them guilt-trip me, even though it seemed a bit cruel. Then there was a period of silence. I stopped receiving calls and messages from unidentified family members. They must have known I wouldn't back down, but I couldn't shake the nagging sensation, the tiny voice in the back of my mind that kept asking me whether I was wrong. Even though they had wronged me and had no right to demand my money, I couldn't help but question whether I was being too harsh. Perhaps I had simply become so accustomed to feeling anger that I had lost the ability to feel anything else. Even though I knew I had done nothing wrong, it was difficult to get rid of the shame. Still, I couldn't stop doubting myself. That's the problem with family. They are fully aware of the most painful spot to strike you. And there's this part of you that questions whether they're correct, even while you're advocating for yourself. Ultimately, though, I had to tell myself that I had endured their decisions and indifference to my feelings for years, and I wasn't going to let them to reintegrate. Just because they didn't like my response didn't mean I was going to let them ruin the life I had finally begun to establish for myself. So I stood my ground, blocked them once again, and went on. I kept telling myself I was doing it anyhow, following the altercation with my dad's wife in the grocery shop. I hoped that everything would eventually settle down. I had been honest with her about my feelings, and I thought that perhaps, just possibly, they would understand and stop bothering me. If anything, though, after a few days, things only became worse. It appeared as though the entire extended family had made the decision to organize an intervention. All of a sudden, everyone had an idea about what I need to do and how I should put things right. Family helps family. According to these sporadic texts I would receive from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them continued by saying that I was being unforgiving and that harboring grudges only makes the bearer sick. They seemed to be reading from the same screenplay, which my dad or his wife had most likely supplied. It seemed as though they portrayed me as the antagonist, someone who was too heartless to assist a sick child, which couldn't be further from the reality. The worst thing was when they began tagging me in social media posts. When we're gone, I'd see these guilt-trippy quotes on my page. Family is all we have, and a heart that is able to forgive is also capable of healing. I would roll my eyes till I could almost see my own brain. I ultimately made the decision to remove several of them. I didn't require that kind of coercion or manipulation, but naturally, it resulted in further drama as I received messages asking how I might be deleted. You're behaving as though you don't belong in your own family. I simply stopped paying attention to everything because it became so absurd. But they persisted. My dad's sister, with whom I hardly ever communicated, sent me a lengthy email a few days later. She said that family was all we had in this world and that I should be compassionate even before all of this. As though I hadn't gone through my own experience and had my own sentiments about it, she really had the audacity to say that I was too young to comprehend. It seemed as though no one could see my side of the story, as though I was just expected to set aside years of pain and betrayal because they felt it was convenient. However, it was a group communication from my dad's parents that really got me upset, because they had been close to my dad's bride from the start and believed she would give him fresh life after my mom died. My grandparents were always a touch aloof with me. They acted as though her daughter was as much their grandchild as I was, and they essentially regarded her as a savior. However, they went one step farther with this communication. Although they acknowledged that I was still sad, they said that I needed to move on from the past. They discussed how my dad's stepdaughter was like family, and how it was my duty as her elder brother to help her through this difficult time. "We know your mom would want you to do the right thing," they concluded. For me, it was it. I felt like I was hit in the stomach by that final statement regarding my mother. Here they were, recalling my mother. In the first place, they hardly regarded it, in an attempt to coerce me into paying them money. I recall feeling a mixture of despair and wrath as I simply stared at the television. When they sold the ring, it seemed as though they didn't just take away the final remnant of her. To make me feel worse, they were now bringing up her memories in this mess. That evening, I took a seat and composed a reply. I was not going to remain silent any longer. Since they had hardly recognized my mother after she passed away, I informed them that they had no right to bring her up and that they had no clue what she would have wanted. I informed them that my dad had no right to sell the ring because it had been mine and mine alone. I explained everything. The treachery, the grief, everything. I also warned them that I would have to break off communication if they didn't respect my decision to avoid becoming involved in their problem. I sat there with a strange sensation of relaxation after hitting submit. I was unsure of their reaction, but I didn't give a damn. I had finally expressed my feelings to them rather than keeping them to myself for the first time. Naturally, however, the repercussions was virtually instantaneous. My granny first apologized grudgingly, stating she was sorry I felt that way. This type of non-apology essentially states, "I'm sorry you're angry, but I'm not going to make things better." Then family members began falling like flies, one by one. People unfriended me, blocked me, and my phone became silent. I refused to tell lies. Although it was painful, I felt as though a burden had been lifted. I didn't have to put up with the incessant manipulation or constantly defending myself. Then my father arrived at my house. It had been months, perhaps a year, since I'd last seen him. I didn't anticipate it. I froze, therefore, as I opened the door and found him standing there. He appeared older. He seemed more exhausted, as if the situation had worn him out. However, I could tell he wasn't there to make amends the moment he opened his lips. "I assumed you would at least be civil enough to speak to me directly, looking around as if you didn't want to be there," he said. I leaned against the doorframe with my arms folded. "Discuss what? You've long since made up your mind." He let out a sigh as though I were the one acting irrationally. "I am making every effort to assist your sister." That word was his. I was furious at sister. I was quite straightforward with him, telling him that she was his wife's daughter and not my sister. He gave me a look as though I had smacked him, but I had no intention of giving up. I wasn't going to allow him to change the course of history because it suited him after all this time. "Why are you unable to let it go?" He shook his head in question. "Are you harboring resentment against a ring?" I snapped that it wasn't simply a ring. Mom's ring was on it. And you sold it as if it didn't exist. And now, as if I owe you something, you're returning for more. For what seemed like an eternity, we stood silently. Ultimately, he simply sighed, looked down and uttered, "You're not the person I raised." At that, I gave a little sour laugh. "No, I'm not. You spent years ignoring me while you established a new life with your new family. And you want me to fix it now that it's coming apart. I'm finished. Dad, without saying another word, I'm done being your fallback option." I took a step back, shut the door, and secured it. He remained there for a minute, appearing disoriented as if he was still in shock over what had just transpired as I observed from the window. He eventually turned and left. He drooped his shoulders. It ought to have been gratifying, perhaps even victorious. However, it didn't. It simply felt definitive. I sat in my flat with an odd mixture of melancholy and relief. I felt as though a phase of my life had suddenly finished, and I had no idea what was next. However, I was certain that I would not allow him or anybody else to use guilt to coerce me into participating in their drama once more. I wasn't going to allow them to pull me back down since I had worked too hard to get here. I felt truly free for the first time. I was no longer caught up in their guilt trips or expectations. I could simply concentrate on getting ahead and taking care of myself. I knew I had taken the correct decision, even though I would probably always wish things had turned out differently. It seemed as though everything had finally come together once I closed the door on my dad. In years, for the first time. I didn't feel like I was always waiting for an apology or recognition that would never materialize. I let it all out, told him how I truly felt, and ended it the way I wanted. And I was truly done for the first time. At first, the ensuing quiet was almost unnerving. I had grown accustomed to the incessant background noise of family turmoil after all the calls, messages, and guilt trips. Now, however, there was just tranquility. No arbitrary phone calls, no passive-aggressive posts from distant family members on social media. I had no one to tell me how I should feel. It was just me, my tiny apartment, and the life I had created. Naturally, questions began to surface despite all of that freedom. Leaving someone you've known your entire life, no matter how badly they hurt you, can be difficult at times. Holidays or sporadic weekends come to mind. When my dad was truly around, I would have that strange mixture of sorrow and nostalgia. However, I would quickly get over it when I thought about the last several years and the ongoing treachery. I would tell myself that I could be happy without them. Work was really helpful. I gave my job my all, worked long hours, and made an effort to better myself. Additionally, I began forming new friendships over time. People who didn't know about all the turmoil and didn't treat me like the girl with family problems or the estranged daughter. I felt like I could finally move on from my past without it weighing me down, and it was wonderful. A month or so after my most recent altercation with my father, one of the few people who hadn't taken sides in the entire situation was my aunt, who sent me a note. She had always been more of a neutral party. She would occasionally check in or send a brief text on my birthday, but she never got particularly engaged. She said that after everything with the family, she simply wanted to make sure I was doing okay. I intended to disregard it in part. Let sleeping dogs rest, please. However, I was interested, so I sent her a casual note in return. I assured her that everything was well and that I was concentrating on my work and avoiding the turmoil. She seemed to be trying to avoid saying too much since she responded with a lot of, "I understand, and that must have been hard." Then she suddenly revealed something shocking. It seems that in between the medical expenditures, my dad and his wife had experienced financial difficulties. Their additional costs as well as any other issues they had been facing. They were overworked. My aunt intimated that they were having more difficulties than I had thought, but she did not elaborate. In order to pay off whatever debt they may have accrued from the treatments and other expenses, they would even list their home for sale. I should have felt anything when I heard that. Perhaps a twinge of sympathy, perhaps a sense of fulfillment, perhaps even a twinge of remorse. To be honest, though, I felt absolutely nothing. It was as though I had come to the finish of a tale that I had long since given up on. I didn't mean to hurt them, but I also wasn't going to rush back to their aid. They had made the same decisions that I had. "I thought you should know it's still family after all," my aunt concluded her message. And for a time, that portion stayed with me. When they treat you like an afterthought, what exactly does family mean? When they don't genuinely care about you, they simply seek out because they need something? I understood that I owed them nothing just because we were related. DNA was only one aspect of family. It was about individuals that truly cared about you, respected you, and thought highly of you. It wasn't them either. I returned my attention to those who had supported me in the months that followed, not out of duty, but out of real concern. My friends, the distant relatives, checked in. I began to realize that my chosen family was far more valuable than the one I was born into. Over the years, I'd had enough of my dad and his wife. I refused to let them disturb my tranquility. The calls and mails eventually stopped altogether. I suppose they finally understood that I wouldn't be their bulwark and that they couldn't use shame or familial devotion to keep me accountable. And that was okay with me. I had tried to be the daughter they want for far too long, awaiting their arrival, to respect me. However, those times were past. I had had enough of waiting for an unattainable goal. People who weren't fully informed might occasionally inquire about my family, new acquaintances, workplace, etc. They would ask whether you have siblings or if you are close to your parents. And I just respond, "No, it's just me," with a smile. It seemed right, and it was simpler that way. I didn't have to go into all the drama or provide the entire narrative. They only wanted to know that I was doing okay by myself. And to be honest, for the first time in my life, I was more than fine. I felt as though I was finally living for myself and not always watching my back to see if my dad might change his mind. I didn't require his forgiveness or his approval. I had allowed myself to go on and let go, and I needed no more closure than that. I had built a life that was all mine at the end of the year. I had a successful career. Compared to my own family, my close-knit circle of pals felt more like family. And I had at last come to terms with all that had transpired. I had lost my anger. I was unharmed. I had endured everything, experienced every bit of that suffering, and emerged from it stronger. In retrospect, I saw that I had truly been freed by losing them. I had to find strength because of that. I was unaware that I needed to defend myself in ways I never would have imagined. And although it wasn't simple, it was worthwhile. For the first time, I was living with people who truly cared about me and on my own terms. I am now at last putting a permanent end to that chapter. Don't ponder what may have happened. No more holding out for unanswered apologies. Just me going about my life without the burden I had carried for so long. I might not have the family I had hoped for. I may, nevertheless, take pride in my life, and I think that's plenty.